So how are you doing? Tell me.
I'm good. I'm good. Just did some CrossFit workout this morning, so that was good. Yeah,
That is
have to
great.
stay fit.
Yeah,
Mm,
totally. So let us just start with the podcast now. Uh,
yeah,
I've got some questions for you. So the first would be like, how are you doing? How are you really doing? What's up
I'm
these
doing
days?
fine. Yeah, busy, more busy than what is good for my health, I think. But
Yeah.
but yeah, I'm doing well. I'm doing well. I became a grandfather a year ago, so I was on my grandson's
Congratulations,
first birthday.
congratulations.
Thank you. So I was at his first birthday this Sunday, and so yeah, with the whole family. So that was good. So I'm doing great. Thank you.
That is great. And what is the feeling of becoming a grandfather?
Much bigger than I thought. In fact, it is an amazing feeling to see this little boy. So little Arthur. So
Yeah,
Arthur, just like in King Arthur. So he's a healthy little, very very active little boy. So that is great. Yeah.
okay, that is great. That is great. Okay, so Mr. Kenneth, I've got some questions for you. So let's start with that. Can you give me a brief introduction about yourself and your younger self? Where did you grow up? What was your education? What did you pursue and everything?
Well, I'm born in Denmark,
Okay.
and my whole family is in aviation. Almost my whole family. My mother, my father, aunts, uncles, cousins, most of them are in aviation. I moved. My mother moved to. My father died early, and then my mother at one point moved to France. When I was 18, I moved out from home, and in order to support myself, I got a job within Scandinavian Airlines. When I was still doing my studies. After my studies was finished, Scandinavian Airlines asked me, "Do you want to stay for full time?" I was on like part-time job there, and I
Yeah,
said, "Yeah, it would be good with some extra income." It was certainly not my plan. My plan was, in fact, to be an engineer.
okay.
That's always has a lot of interest for me. So I started in SAS technical department, and so I have technical background now, and that also interested me. That was supporting my engineer dream. Then later in the mid 90s, I got the possibility of taking a flight dispatch license on a flight school in Denmark. And SAS said to me, "You have to quit your job in order to do this, and then apply for a new job after that." So I was
Got it.
like, okay, I quit my job, and I went to the school for some months there, and passed the exams, and got my flight dispatch license. In Denmark, they issue a flight dispatch license. Only 12 countries, in fact, in Europe issue a license.
Okay.
So it's an area that is not working out very, very well, in fact, in Europe,
Got it.
compared
Got
to
it.
United States, that where it's very, very, very regulated. Um, but new stuff coming up. I work within EASA also, so new stuff is coming up. However, I got the license and applied for the job. I was lucky to get the job, so I started in SAS flight dispatch in 1997. And after a while there, they asked me if I want to be head of education. So that's how my whole instructing career
Got it.
started. So they gave me a lot of courses, classroom instructor courses, and I got an NLP, neuro linguistic programming education, and different other educations, and was ready to be instructor. So I was hired by a flight school to train pilots first in crew resource management. Then later on, I trained in another flight school. I trained flight planning and navigation, and also sometimes meteorology. Then later on, I got to a third flight school. So I did all this typically on my days off, in the evenings and so on, next to my job in SAS.
Got it.
Then in
That is great.
2002, I got a possibility of becoming the flight dispatch and control manager in Emirates Airline in Dubai.
Oh,
And I took the job, and I spent 4 years in Dubai as a flight dispatch and control manager there. And then my wife finished her education, and she wanted to go home because she was a veterinarian. She could not use her license in Dubai at that time. So she wanted to go home, and yeah, the funny thing is we are talking about it. Sorry. We are talking about it in over dinner one evening, and she says, "I would like to go back to Denmark." And I said, "Okay, that's fine, but I don't have a job in Denmark, and basically
yeah.
I need a job." So next morning, Scandinavian Airlines called me and offered me my old job back. Yeah, so that was a little bit funny. And I quit my job in Emirates
Dubai.
Airlines in
Okay.
Dubai, and moved back to my old job in SAS, but was contacted by several companies if I want to do some training instructing on the side. At that time, I was in contact now with IFALDA, the International Federation of Airline Dispatchers Association, which is a mother organization over all dispatchers in the whole world. And just like pilots has IFALPA and air traffic controllers has IFATCA, dispatchers has IFALDA. And and through them, I got in contact with some companies. So I started doing some instructing on the side, and then I opened up, still working for SAS, I opened up a company on the side, a training company called Kronborg Air Consults. And
Okay.
yeah, so I did this on the side, and then I was contacted by IFALDA. At one point, they asked me if I want to be the president of IFALDA, and I was that from 2014 to 2017 in a period of 3 years. But then I decided it was time for some change in my life. So I quit my job my well-paid job with SAS. I quit the job as president for IFALDA, and I went full-time instructing for myself, my own private company,
Okay.
and doing instructing full-time. And I did that for a couple for some years, and then one day I got in contact with a crazy Belgium guy, Vincent, and he contacted me and said, first of all, he needed training for some of his dispatchers, and this was during COVID.
Okay.
So I said, yeah, that's fine. I can only do virtual online training because I cannot travel during COVID.
Yeah.
And he said, yeah, but that's fine. And he said, also, I have a couple of other things I want to talk to you about. So we said, I hear you are a very, very good instructor. I said, thank you very much. I'm really honored that I have some sort of reputation out there. And he said, but you're not very good at making websites. He said, no, that's not my strong side. And he
Yeah.
also said, you are not very good in sales and marketing. No, that's also not my strong side. I'm a more technical guy.
Yeah.
And then he said, I'm very good in these things. Should we talk? And then we talked for 3-4 months, and we decided to create IFOA, the International Flight Operational Academy.
That is
And
great.
now IFOA is, we created the company in Switzerland, as Vincent was living in Switzerland. Now we have created IFOA India,
Okay.
situated in New Delhi. We have just created IFOA United States, which is gonna be basically handled by Vincent. I will be
Got it.
responsible for Europe, and we have a guy in India who will be responsible for that for India. And then we are very soon opening up in Dubai.
That
We
is
just
great.
got the approval from GCAA in Dubai to open up a flight dispatch training company there as well. So we are growing, and we are only 3 years old, a little over 3 years old, but we are growing very, very fast, and we get fantastic feedback from our customers, and we have now more than 60 customers. Lately here we are start getting requests from large passenger airlines, which was not our goal. In fact, we got now one of the big four ones in the United States. We got now just got a major passenger airline in Europe because our goal was mainly the business jet segment and cargo segment.
Yeah.
So we have almost a whole DHL group and Aerologic as cargo airlines, but mainly we are having that type of the big passenger airlines. They have typically their own internal training department.
Yes.
But yeah, they're starting contacting us, and I'm going to one of them here in a couple of weeks. So yeah, so that's gonna be exciting.
That is great. Actually, I live in New Delhi, so that's good to hear that you have an office there. So that is great. And actually, you answered my next question, which I was about to ask you, which was how did you find IFOA? And you answered that very beautifully. So also, I had another question. See, you founded this company in 2021, right? And like within just 2 years, you have expanded it successfully. So how did you do that? And what was the process behind it? Did you take any funding, or was it bootstrapped company, or what was it?
Yeah, first of all, when we started out, Vincent and I, we didn't take out any salary for ourselves for the first 9 months. So in order to build up some capital. And then luckily we have a good friend who wanted to invest in our company. So he bought some shares. So our company is an LLC. So it's a company with shares, and our good friend here has some shares and invested some money in our company. So we have some startup, because expanding like into India, Dubai, United States, it costs quite a lot of money, in fact.
Totally.
Because when you're building up new companies, there's a lot of fees, government fees, a lot of other fees. Sometimes you need a lawyer, and they're very expensive, and it simply costs money. So we needed to have some capital, and we got that. And then of course we have good success. We have, for me personally, I'm fully booked the rest of the year until Christmas as an instructor. So and we have some freelance instructors that we use also. We have Richard, which has just been doing training for our India department. We just did a conversion course for new young pilots that has been converted from pilot into flight dispatcher, a 3-week course. So we just finished that one last week, in fact. Our guy in Dubai says now he has another course here in July. So sorry, Dubai, in New Delhi, so of course. So it looks like our Indian sister company now is starting moving very, very fast. Very
That's great.
fast. Yeah.
And what do you think? Rest of the world and India, is it different to build a audience and business here? And was it more cost efficient, or was it more expensive? What do you think about the Indian market for a business?
So first of all, it's less expensive to open up a company in India.
Yeah,
so
totally.
so that's good. So that was helpful, of course, because we are not a rich company. We don't have enormous amount of funds, so that was really nice for us. Second of all, what attracted us very much to India is that we got a very, very good contact there, Sudarshan, and which is a former captain, and we had some very good talks with him. He has some extremely good contacts, and if you want to move into a market as an Indian market, you need to know somebody who knows somebody. Or else we could not just come ourselves and start up a company there. That would be impossible. So he's very, very well. Sudarshan is very, very well connected within the civil authorities and within aviation in generally. He knows a lot of people. He's been in aviation for the last 30 years, and that helped us a lot. So he will be managing our whole Indian operation. Of course, we talk on the phone and we email and anything that needs to be cleared up, we do that. Of course, no problem. But yeah, this is and another thing here. The Indian market is the Indian aviation market is very attractive, and the reason for that is that India is the country in the world that has the most aircrafts on order right now.
That is good to hear. I didn't know that.
More aircrafts, more dispatchers. Simply as that.
Totally.
And that's what we do. We educate flight dispatchers, and we do have some courses for pilots also, and we also have courses for other OCC staff, crew control, for instance, and others like that. But our main task, our main business is the flight dispatcher. That is what we do.
And if you can disclose, what is the valuation of your company now?
The value of our company?
Yeah.
I have no idea.
Okay.
I guess the value of a piece of commodity is exactly the value that at that time of day, and that can change tomorrow, and that can change next month. So if you go down today and buy a liter of milk in the local supermarket, that can change the value of that liter. If you buy one in 1 month, it might be more expensive or it might be cheaper.
Yeah, totally.
I have no idea. I'm not really concerned about the value of our company right now because we are not selling the company. So
got it.
So that's what you could say fictive money. It's not money in the bank for that. It's just so. But when we one day decide to sell it, if there's somebody who want to buy it, then this question is very relevant. But it takes a lot to evaluate a company. You know, you need lawyers that come in and they look at on how many do you have, how is your brand, do you have a good brand, and there's a lot of things that affects the value of a company.
Yeah, totally. And do you plan on bringing any new investor in the company as you're expanding very fast?
Yeah, we're not bringing any investors into the main company. Here we are 3 owners, me, Vincent, and our good friend here. So not that, but we do that with our subsidiaries, like I4 India, I4 Dubai. Here we are bringing in some extra people that will have a part of the share. We do that in Dubai because we are teaming up with a very good company in Dubai, Al Maktoum Airport, and they do training of cabin crew. So they have full simulators for cabin crew, swimming pool, everything they have there. So we don't go out and create our own. We try to keep the costs low. So no big spending here. So we keep the cost low. We try to partner up with others, and basically we like to partner instead of being in competition. And I can give you one example of that. There's a flight dispatch training company in Italy, and Jester school there, and a really nice guy who owns the school. And instead of being in direct competition with him, we partnered up with him. So we said we made a partner agreement with him and agreed how we divide the market and in Europe, and we find that to be a better solution than just direct competition. Of course,
if you partner up, you grow faster.
You grow faster.
Yeah.
And also, we can help each other out a little bit. So if he comes and says, "Hey, I need training material for this and this," okay, we help out each other a little bit. Of course, we do have competition, no doubt about that. But so we cannot do that with everyone. That doesn't work out with everyone. But as much as we can do, we partner up because we find that to be more healthy. And being good contact with other people, with other. I mean, why are we here? We are basically here because we want to keep aviation safe.
Yeah.
And whenever I do a training, it is always with the intent that one day the dispatchers that are gonna dispatch an aircraft might have my kids or my new grandson on board the aircraft. So I really want them to do a very, very good job. I really want to make sure that this is safe. So that's the intention of my when I do training. I do not stand there and think about money or anything else. I think about safety for aviation. And
that's great.
you know, when we have an airplane crash, it affects everybody in aviation. Then there's no competitors. And let me give you a couple examples. You remember when the 737 MAX there, it had two different crashes due to the MCAS system. And this affected everybody in aviation. It affected, of course, Boeing very, very, very hard. It affected Icelandair. It affected Norwegian Airlines that was really, really, really close to bankruptcy. It affected Southwest Airlines in the United States enormously. They had to cancel many flights every day because of this. And same with a lot of other airlines. So one crash will not affect only that airline, that single company. It will affect a lot. So aviation safety is everybody's responsibility. Everybody's responsibility, no matter. And here we are not competitors, really. IFOA's little contribution to that is that we want to do we want to do our very best to keep aviation safe, and by that going into a market which is way operational staff, flight dispatchers, flight operation officers, or whatever. Some countries call them FOO, some countries call them flight dispatchers, some countries call them operational staff. It is the same persons doing the same type of job, and they look at the weather, they plan the route, they look at military exercises, they look at equipment not working, they look at MELs, they look at a lot of things, and in order to do that, you have to have some education. You cannot just be the local girl from the local supermarket. You have to have training and education for that.
And would you say a flight dispatcher or a flight operation manager is the most hard job in aviation?
No, I don't think. I don't know. That was a difficult question. I don't. Maybe there's plenty of hard jobs in aviation where you are. I think no matter if you're on ground staff or you are cabin crew or cockpit crew, or your technical department, there's a lot of tough jobs there. Check-in, air traffic controllers, plenty of tough jobs out there. So, but we all need each other. We cannot. It's like a chair. If you remove one leg of the chair, the chair will fall down. So we need all the parts in aviation. Everybody's jobs are important, but the flight dispatchers, of course, is very important also, because the pilot typically meets in about 1 hour before the departure. So in that 1 hour, he or she have to check the documentation of what the flight dispatcher have done, and they cannot go so thoroughly into details because they basically only have 1 hour, and in that hour they also have to go to the aircraft, they have to set up the aircraft, they have to do their walk around, do all the checks, their checklists, everything. So they have a limited amount of time, so they basically have to trust that the dispatcher has done a correct job. So of course the pilot reads the weather, the NOTAM, checks the flight plan, but that's basically the time they have for it. They also have to do performance calculation. Maybe the dispatcher already did performance calculation, but that doesn't matter. The pilot has to do it again with the latest updated weather. So it is really necessary that this is a well-trained person. In United States and some other countries, the dispatcher and the pilot, they have shared responsibility. In Europe, for instance, it is 100% operation control is 100% the captain. That's not the case in the United States and some other countries where they have 50-50 shared responsibility. And but what I do see in Europe is that, especially younger captains, they more and more connect with their dispatcher. So they trust them, they call them, and say, hey, what do I do here? And let's take an example. Let's say you have a sick passenger on board.
Yeah.
So passenger needs to go to a hospital. So the aircraft needs to divert. Okay. So there's three airports right in front of the flight here. And after a short check, all three airports are performance-wise very suitable for landing. But it would be pretty idiotic for the pilot to choose the airport with no hospital.
Yeah.
And how can a pilot know that? A pilot doesn't know where every hospital is in the world.
Yeah.
So you need help from ground, right? You need somebody to tell you, hey, no, please divert here. Or maybe there's one of the airports has no fuel available. How can he know? He cannot know. He's sitting up in an aircraft high up in the sky. He cannot know. So maybe we got landed, got the passenger to a hospital, but we cannot depart again because there's no fuel. So there's a lot of things to take into considerations. And here, this collaboration between air traffic control, between pilot, between flight dispatcher is a really, really important three-legged chair, important collaboration between these three very, very important actors in aviation. So if you had a question about how do I see the flight dispatch job evolving, then my answer to that would be I certainly see it evolving. I see the software, the technical things are getting more and more automated, just like for the pilot. So less production, more monitoring. So that's how the dispatch job is evolving. More artificial intelligence is sneaking in slowly. And then people are saying, oh, we are going to lose our jobs. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The dispatcher will be there. Now new type of dispatch job will come up. And that will be the drone dispatcher. That we will see a new type of job coming up, when we very soon see that commercial drones are being approved very shortly in most countries. Australia already approved it, for instance.
Okay. Let's say someone wants to become a flight dispatcher. So what is the process of it? How do you become a flight dispatcher?
Well, first of all, you have to have the age, and in most countries, minimum age to go to an exam is 21. So you can basically start before that, but once you take the exam and you want the license, you have to be minimum 21 years of age. In the United States, it's 23 years of age. So there's an age limit or age barrier here. Second of all, you need to find a good school, plenty of good schools, not only ours, around the world, and then you go and do the training. Once you have taken the initial training on a school, the theoretical part, then you are what, according to ICAO, what we call a FOO, flight operation officer. Then you go out with an airline. Hopefully you get a job, but you can also go to, there are some airlines where you can go and ask, can I do my practical part of the training? Then you go and do the practical part, typically minimum of 3 months, but sometimes longer. You do the practical part, and once you finish that, now you are a flight dispatcher.
Okay.
That's how it is, and that's according to ICAO Doc 10.10.6.
Like when you become a pilot, so like when you become a pilot, so you have to go through like certain hours of flight hours in order to get your license. So is it the same case with flight dispatchers? Like you have to go through some hours of training?
Absolutely. Same. And I mean, a lot of the training are the same as the pilots are going through: metrology, flight monitoring, navigation, flight planning. There's a lot of things that are pretty much the same. Of course, if you come to instrumentations and aircraft systems, it is a little bit less. The dispatcher doesn't have to be a technician, and for metrology, the dispatcher doesn't have to be a metrologist. but they have to have an idea of how weather is progressing. They have to have an idea of the technical parts of an aircraft. So when I say an APU is not working, then the dispatcher immediately has to say to his brain, okay, then my flight is not approved for ETOPS. So stuff like that, but that doesn't mean that the dispatcher have to know how to repair the damn thing. No, they just have to know the consequences of it, and that's why the training is really, really important. One day, a CEO of a company, he comes down to me during the training, during the lunch break, and he says to me, "Why should I pay your company a lot of money for training my dispatchers? I think they do fine without training." I said, I can easily give you that answer. Because if you one Friday evening, one Saturday evening, your dispatcher is making a serious mistake because they're not well trained, it will cost you tens of more money. 3 years, so you could hire me for 3 years for that mistake, because aviation is so expensive when you make mistakes. We are not talking a taxi company here. We're talking an airline, and it costs a lot of money when the dispatchers are making mistakes. So just from a money point of view, it's a good idea to train your dispatchers. And of course, from the correct point of view, the safety point of view, then it's a really matter. And then he said to me, okay, I hear you, continue the training. And then he left.
Totally. So, how much does this cost to be a flight dispatcher? The whole process, the licensing process, the school fees and everything?
Well, that depends on the country you're in. In different countries can be, but typically we are looking at somewhere between, and if it's a license you're going, not all countries have a license. Some countries like India, or my country, Denmark, and the United States, they have a license, but some countries do not have a license, like France. They don't have a license, or Spain, for instance. But typically a course, the initial course is typically somewhere between 3,000 to 4,000 euros or dollars, in that range. In United States, probably a little bit more. We were looking maybe up to $5,000 for a course over there. And then comes, of course, the practical training. That's another thing. And then comes additional training, which come advanced training like ETOPS training, and other advanced trainings. And then typically in any country in the world, you have to have recurrent training. Some dangerous goods you have to have every second year, and others trainings every 3 years. You have to have recurrent training in like metrology, for instance. So it's a continuous. We keep the dispatcher current, and so a dispatch course, the initial raw classroom course, $3,000 to $5,000, and then of course the cost of, if you're a private person, then you have to find an airline that want to do some training for you if you're lucky. But if you're hired through an airline, then the airline will make sure you get the practical part of the course.
Got it. And how much can you expect to make when you're a flight dispatcher? Oh,
that depends very much of the country you're in. Some countries the salary are extremely low, and in some countries it is extremely high. You take Switzerland. Is typically 7,000 to 9,000 euros per month. If you take United States, they start, if you start in a small airline in United States, it's typically around $50,000 per year. But I just was in Miami a couple of weeks ago, and I asked a couple of the dispatchers, can I indiscreetly ask you about salary in your company for dispatcher? And one of the guys there says, I'm making $100,000 per year in one of the 4 major airlines. But he said, then you can take overtime. And with that, you can make much more money. And he said, we had 2 guys here in 2023 that took every overtime they could get. And they reach a very, very high salary, more than $200,000. And if you have some experience, you've been there some years, you may be a senior dispatcher or dispatch. In the United States, they have something called a superintendent, a next level or above that, then you can easily make 150,000 per year US dollars. But you come to some small, if you come to Africa or you come to some Eastern European countries, the salary can be very low, as low as 1,000 euros per month. So yeah, a very, very big jump,
Yeah, totally.
depending on where you are in the world. And which
Got it.
airline you work for. Typically, larger scheduled airlines, they pay higher salaries.
Got it. I mean, it's the same disparity between the pilot salaries too, which airline you're working for and from where you're working, right?
Yeah, that's completely the same. You work for a small airline, your pilot salary might be quite low. You're working for United Airlines, you get really good salary as or Emirates Airline, you get very good salary as both as a dispatcher and a pilot.
Okay, great. Okay, so Mr. Kenneth, I had one more question for you. Like, what is your vision for IFOA for, like, say, the next 5 years?
Well, that vision is very, very clear. We are now the biggest flight dispatch training company in Europe.
Yeah.
But our clear vision is to be the biggest in the world. So on this planet. So yeah, that's a clear vision, and that's why we're opening up in the United States, as this is a big market. That's why we open up in India, as this is an enormous market. And but also Dubai, to make sure that we reach rest of Middle East is a very growing aviation market also, but also that we reach into Africa and other markets from there. So here we can support the Indian market, but we have a very big amount of requests of getting what we call the double certification.
Okay.
And that means that especially from the European market, but also from the Indian market, is that people want to have the FAA license. The problem with getting the FAA license is that you're getting American air law, American minima, American way of doing things, which then a company has maybe spent a lot of money on sending a person for many weeks to United States, getting the license. They come back and they are basically only half educated. But now the company spent a lot of money. They don't know the European air law, minima, European ways of doing things. So what we do is we do a blended model. So we educate them in either in the European regulation, EASA regulation, or that could be an Indian regulation, or that could be in the Middle East regulation. And then we send them, after we have trained them there locally, we send them at least 2 weeks to United States, to Florida, and then they get to take the exams there, because there's a lot of things that are similarities. I mean, weather is weather, no matter where you are in the world. So there's a lot of similarities, but there are also some things that are different for the Americans. So they have to learn that also. We train them in that. So then they get what we call basically a double certification. Now they have their own home country, their own regulation. They also have the little plastic card, the FAA certification there. So now they are really happy. They have a piece of plastic card, and now they can. They are also well educated at the same time. This is good for the airline. They get a well educated person in.
Got it. And can you share like one crazy story, or maybe a disaster or a tragedy which happened that the flight dispatcher was not well educated, and from just one mistake it was a big problem or a big disparity?
Oh yeah, there are several stories there. You have the Lamia accident in Central America, where the dispatcher made a flight plan where there was simply not enough trip fuel on, and was being pressured by the captain, which is also part owner of the airline, and They jumped over a fuel stop and flew direct in order to save money, and then it is Murphy's law that if you jump corners, jump over the fence where it's the lowest, then suddenly something else happens, like weather typically. And most accidents are not a single event. Most accidents are a chain of events. And typically weather is always somehow involved, and in most aircraft accidents. And in this Lamia accident, it was the same. And the dispatcher made huge. Later on, the dispatcher was the government there was trying to arrest the dispatcher, but he sought asylum in Brazil, where he still is, by the way. And yeah, there's plenty of others. We had one in Madrid once, where, according to the report, the dispatcher or the pilot was not educated in the performance tool, and then the aircraft took off with too little speed, and they did the aircraft was touching the runway, and they managed to get off, but then they got a hole in the aircraft, and all the masks come down for the passengers, and they were holding for some time, and then came back and landed. So nothing happened, but it was very close to be that, because what in fact happened is a part of the aircraft came off, and then the next aircraft taking off was having a flat tire because of that, managed to take off also into holding, come down and land safely. So nobody was hurt, everything was okay. But if you calculate the cost of all this, it was an enormous amount of cost, and also it was this close of being a major accident. Only because of good pilots, this was saved. So here was basically the flight dispatchers to blame. And then I can mention tons of times stories I heard, especially from business jet segments, where they have made mistakes that has been this close to accidents. So luckily, so that's why we need good education, because aviation is growing like with a very fast pace at the moment.
And do you think that private aircrafts are more prone to accidents, or like, let's say, a tragedy, or some more prone to some weather conditions rather than commercial aircrafts? I mean, they're light with us.
Absolutely. First of all, if you fly privately, you are not under the same regulation.
Got it.
So as if you fly commercially. So they have a quite different regulation. They are not under the same flight time limitation, and they're not under the same minima or ETOPS regulation. And so there's a lot of regulation they're not on. And these regulations are there for a reason. But that's the case if you fly privately. But so we also see a lot of private accidents, of course, with private flights. But we also see, and this is something that has big attentions to ICAO, FAA, and EASA the last 10 years, is that we've seen a lot of runway excursions. That's in fact where we have most of the accidents today. So that's why the new regulation, the new SNOTAM, the new GRF format came out in 2021 from ICAO, and the new update to ICAO Annex 3 was fully adopted by EASA, by the way, where you have to calculate with gusts on crosswind component. That came out. So now dispatchers have to know how to calculate the crosswind, if we have to take an example. And there's no decent app on the market, or maybe very few at least, but most of the apps on the market for your mobile phone, they do not calculate with variation. And as the geographic North Pole has been moving very fast, it's no longer, it's no longer in Canada, it's now in Russia. So as the geographic North Pole has been moved very fast, then the variation has also changed. And we have a lot of airports with high variation. I could take Helsinki with 10 degrees eastern variation. So we have to calculate with that when we calculate the costs on planning stage, because that could mean that your alternate may not be valid, your ETOPS may not be valid, or whatever. And this is for ETOPS we always had to calculate with cost, but for alternate, destination, and route alternate, all these airports, we now have to calculate with cost. That is the new law.
Yeah.
And people need to learn that. And all the classes I come to, there's nobody who can calculate crosswind component. Nobody. So when I start the class and I say, can you calculate, I take up an example on the board. It says, can you calculate the crosswind for me? Nobody can calculate it. So then we do the training and we train that. So yeah, absolutely, very, very necessary.
I mean, crosswind is the most important part, I think, of any flight. Am I right?
Yeah, well, I guess there's so many important parts. Crosswind, minima, calculating the correct routes, making sure that your route is avoiding severe thunderstorms, for instance. I just saw the map from Singapore Airlines. Having this huge drop in altitude and a lot of injured people, and one person died on board. It is very, very clear that the tropopause on the map do like this exactly where they entered this severe turbulence. And that what, if I was the dispatcher on that flight, I would certainly advise my captain, says, hey, we see a severe drop here. So here I would, if we do not change the route, that could also be a possibility. But if they stick with that route, I would say to the captain, here I would advise you to buckle up for all your passengers and your crew, because here we might see some severe turbulence. And they did. So imagine if the dispatcher here had warned the pilot and really did some thorough dispatching. But what we quite often see in many airlines, especially in large schedule airlines, is that for the dispatchers, they have so many flights. They have to do maybe more than 50 flights on a shift. They have so many flights they have to do, so that they don't have time to go into details. And this is an issue, but that's an issue on a broader scale to discuss. That's more a political discussion.
And what is the story behind this Bermuda Triangle?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
The Bermuda Triangle.
Well, there's no story there. There hasn't been any airplanes missing in the Bermuda Triangle for many, many years.
Okay.
So no story in the Bermuda Triangle. So flights go there every day. Plenty of flights. No flights disappearing. So it is more of a myth. And flights in the good old days from the 1920s to the 1950s, they were of a very different quality. An aircraft engine, good old propeller aircraft engine, was failing once a year, where a modern jet engine today, that engine fails once every 30 years. So you see, there's a big difference in engines.
Yeah, that's a big leap
from the 1950s and until today. And imagine if we had the same development in your car engines. And I'm not talking electrical car engines, but normal gasoline, diesel car engines. If we had the same development in these engines that we had the last 30, 40 years in our airplane engines, then you would be running 200 kilometers on a liter of gasoline in your car. And nobody would have been talking about any sustainability within cars and electrical cars and all that discussion, because it would have been extremely efficient engines. That's how efficient the development has been in aviation. But nobody is talking about that when they talk sustainability, how much we in fact have done already. And how much the dispatcher is doing to find the shortest route, the best flight levels, the cheapest route, where we use the less fuel as possible. Every day the dispatcher is doing that, saving a lot of fuel, millions of gallons of fuel every day, because they do good work.
That is great. Do you support electrical cars?
I think we should wait until the next development of electrical cars. I think how we produce an electrical car today, it takes many years before it is carbon neutral. In fact, it takes 8 years before a Tesla today is carbon neutral.
Yeah.
So I think the good thing about electrical cars is that your local environment is less polluting. So and I see that in Copenhagen and also in Switzerland, and especially Norway, which is a country with a lot of electrical cars. So polluting in the inner city is dropping, and that is good for people's health. So in that way, electrical cars are really, really good. But if you have to look at it on the bigger scale, how much CO2 emission do we have from producing this car? Then we're still not there.
Yeah, I
we
get
need
you.
another type of batteries before we are there, and they are coming. Tesla will probably soon come with within a year or two. They will come up with a new type of batteries, and then I think we really have something. But also now we see electrical aircrafts. I just visited eBase last week in Geneva, and we saw the new Lilium aircraft, an amazing aircraft. And this is a type of aircraft that is going to go into competition with the car. And so if you want to go from one end of Paris to the other end of Paris in the afternoon, it will take you 4 hours drive. In a car, and a lot of pollution, a lot of CO2 emission. Aircraft that can schedule in within 15 to 30 minutes, depending on the route, over the other side.
I mean, that is totally a time travel. I think I lost your video. Yeah, it's good. Yeah.
Now you're back. Yeah.
Now it's good. And also, what do you think about air taxis? Like Uber is also doing an air taxi right now. So they are developing something like electrical cars too. Air taxis will be a thing in, let's say, about 30 years from now or 50 years from now. So how do you think, I mean, you're a flight instructor, so how would you think a flight operation manager would manage that? Or will it be just like cars? Like people will be flying, they'll get their license and they'll just fly in their flying car or their flying air taxi.
Yeah, first of all, I don't think people will do the flying themselves, and second of all, it will be much sooner than 50 years, my friend. I can tell you that we are that close. So the first thing we need is regulation. We need the air laws to be changed, and the EASA is soon coming out with a package here. Australia has already approved commercial drones, so. Let's say you want to order pizza from Pizza Hut, you do that on your mobile phone, and it can be delivered on certain pickups. 2 or 3 big cities in China has been doing that for a couple of years now, in fact, and it works extremely well. And development of drones has gone really fast the last 3-4 years. Extremely fast, especially with the wars. War is never a good thing. But the development of aviation, when you have a war, is going very fast. And with the Ukraine-Russia war, the Israel-Palestine war, the Armenia-Azerbaijan war, the development of drones has exploded. And that will, hopefully, we don't like war, but that drizzles down to commercial aviation. And so you will see both. Unmanned drones will be very, very soon in many cities under certain regulation, of course. They're very strict regulation, because how do we avoid the drones hitting each other? How do we avoid the drones going into icing conditions or thunderstorms, etc., etc.? And then the next step is, of course, as you said, flying cars or taxis, air taxis. And air taxis, they are almost here. We are talking 3 years. Then this is so that's almost here, 3 years. For people to manage their own vehicle in the sky, I don't see that happening. I don't see what we see in Star Wars happening. I think people are terrible drivers. So and also we're probably gonna see that something like a driver's license is not gonna exist in the future. So you will still have normal cars running on ground, but it will just be controlled by a computer instead. today 10,000 people die every year in car accidents in Europe.
Mhm.
So that's that could be avoided with automated cars. So I think we're gonna see that within a period of maybe 10 to 20 years. You see that the driver's license doesn't exist anymore. So your kids will probably never get a driver's license. My grandson will
Yeah.
probably never get a driver's license because it's gonna expire. It's not just a thing of the future.
Mhm.
And
And
this
AI
is
will
how
be playing
aviation,
a
this is
great
because
role
of
in this.
what we do in aviation now. In
Yeah,
fact.
And I think AI will be a major game changer in all of this.
Yeah, well, when we're discussing AI, we always have to be careful what is automation and what is AI for, because if you look into the
Yeah,
definition of AI, it is a self-learning program.
yeah.
And that we do not have in aviation yet. But we have we have a lot of automation. We have an autopilot on an aircraft. We have plenty of automation in softwares today. But AI, absolutely, it will come, but it is something that we have to develop regulation for.
Yeah.
We have to be very careful about, very careful
Yes.
in aviation, to take away the human element and completely replace it with because common sense. That's why there's a difference between hard law and soft law.
Mhm.
Because soft law allowed for common sense. And if there's one big thing we have in aviation, then it's weather.
Yeah.
And weather is deteriorating. We have global warming, so we just get more and more nasty weather, and therefore we need a human with common sense to say, okay, this is a bad idea. Even though the law allows me to do it, it's a bad idea.
Yeah.
And maybe we see AI come to that kind of common sense one day, but
Yeah, but it's far away. It's far away.
we are still quite far away.
Yeah,
It's not that well developed yet.
I get it. So, Mr. Kenneth, it was great talking with you. And that was it. All I have to ask you. And it was great. You shared great wisdom, some great information about the aviation industry. And I hope IFOA becomes the world's best aviation education company in, let's say, next 5 years. And I hope that
Thank you.
happens.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you. Who will be listening to this podcast?
So the base audience is just entrepreneurs and people who want to do business.
Yeah.
So they're the base audience.
Okay. Yeah. Well, good. Thank you for the time, and very interesting.
Yeah, you too. And have a nice day, Mr.
You,
Kenneth.
and send me a link
Yeah, sure.
for the podcast. Yeah.
Whenever it comes out, in about 2 to 3 days, I'll send you a link on LinkedIn.
Perfect.
Yeah. Have a nice day. Thank you
you
for your time, Mr. Kenneth.
You too. Enjoy the rest of the day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.